Hey, and it was good to pull up to the church today and see the red, white, and blue wreaths on the doors and come in and see our red, white, and blue flowers and the flags here on the communion table. Things looking pretty. We are going to continue our march through Matthew with the King. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5. A little bit of a sensitive topic this morning. I'll try not to be too crude. Looking to lust, Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30. It's a topic that can lend itself to crudeness. Needs to be treated kind of delicately, but nonetheless, it needs to be treated. It's a principle Christ preached, and we must therefore prepare our hearts to stand with His on this issue. Message entitled Looking to Lust. Looking to Lust. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30 this morning. Last week we learned that the Pharisees and the scribes interpreted the law as applying to outward performance only. We've been mentioning that for some time. The Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, all of this, it has to do with our character, a person's character. The Beatitudes, blessed are the merciful, blessed are they which hunger and thirst after righteousness. These are not things that, not outward behaviors so much as it's about our inward bent. Being pure of heart, being peacemakers. This has to do with heart character. But the Pharisees had reduced the Old Testament law down to an outward show and really didn't pay much attention to their heart, their character, their own integrity. As a matter of fact, by the time we get out to verse 20, Christ says this, "For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." And then beginning in verse 21, last week we dealt with the topic of anger. The Pharisees talked, as long as you didn't kill anybody, it was okay, you wasn't guilty of murder. But there beginning in verse 21, we found that the very attitude, the heart attitude of anger is murder itself. It's the seedbed for the outward performance of murder, but it is actually considered murder in God's eyes. It begins in the heart. And so we are responsible for our motives, the motives of our heart, our integrity and characteristics. And then he continues on. And what Christ is doing there in verse 21 with the topic of anger is suggesting to us that the Pharisees themselves are very guilty of these things he's mentioning through here. So he begins talking about, "You have heard it said of them of old time," there in verse 21, "that thou shalt not kill, and whoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment." And so he goes on to call that murder there in that text. And he takes these issues, and every time you come to another phrase, "For you have heard it said, but I say unto you." And so we come to that this morning with the topic of adultery. In weeks coming, we'll deal with the divorce, oaths, retaliation, hatred. In each one of these topics, he begins off with that same formula. "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." And so he's saying, okay, this is what the Pharisees have been teaching you. And it's all about outward performance. But I say unto you, it's about internal integrity. It's about inward purity. And that's exactly how he treats the topic of lust as we approach it this morning in our text. Today we'll see that adultery is not limited to the physical act, but it includes an attitude of the heart. And so let's read our text now, Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30. And let's notice the consequences for just the attitude of lust. The consequences for just the attitude of lust as we read through this. Verse 27, it says, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that the whole body should be cast into hell. That sounds gruesome. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that if one of thy members should perish, and not the whole body should be cast into hell. And God, after blessing the reading of His Word this morning, may open the eyes of our understanding as we begin to unlock the meaning behind the passage. By way of opening illustration, Drew Anderson wrote y'all remember back in the days when you used to get Reader's Digest in the mail? I think they still have an online version. They had a column in there called Life in these United States. It was part of their humor section. Y'all ever remember reading those growing up? I did. I got a good chuckle out of them from time to time. Well, Drew Anderson in July 2007 had submitted an anecdote to Reader's Digest. It was in that issue that year, up under the column of Life in these United States. And he wrote, while my wife and I were shopping at a mall kiosk, a shapely woman in a short form-fitted dress strolled by, and my eyes followed her. Without looking up from the item she was examining, my wife asked the question, was that worth the trouble you're in? And that is the question that Christ asks each one of us. And guys, since we're the ones primarily meant that way, it hits us a little more heavy. Is it worth the trouble we're in? If you remember, I told you to notice the consequences. What happens to the one eat up with lust? Whole body gets cast into hell. Be careful with that. Was that lustful look worth the trouble that we're in? Even if our wives don't catch us, Jesus knows when we're looking to lust. Christ views lust as adultery, and it must be overcome with ferocity. Lust must be mortified with uncompromising self-discipline. And that brings us to our application question. Do I discipline myself not to lust? Is it possible to be that self-disciplined? Well, Scripture says it is. Scripture holds us accountable. Do I discipline myself not to lust? And we're going to notice 5 characteristics of the lustful look. 5 characteristics of the lustful look. The first one is the lustful look is a premeditated look. The lustful look is a premeditated look. Let's begin back in verse 27 and read through 28 now, or part of 28. It says, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. And that's the law. And so Christ always begins by stating what the law is. But he also knows in the minds and the hearts of his listeners that along with hearing that comes some presuppositions. They're understanding it through the lens of what the Pharisees have always told them. Hey, adultery is just an outward act. Think what you want to think in your head and your heart. Who's going to call you on the carpet for that? You can't be stoned to death for just what you are considering in your heart. It's the outward act that gets you in trouble. And so they had made light of inward thoughts that they should not be having. And so now Christ is bringing all that out in the open. He's ripping the covers off of it. And he's adjusting their worldview to something more proper, to something, to actually the way God views lust. God views adultery as lust. And so verse 28 continues, but I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to what? Lust after her. hath committed adultery with her already. Verse 28 begins, but I say unto you, whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her. That means one is looking intentionally. One is doing the looking intentionally to be transfixed, to be transfixed in a state of sexual longing, to satisfy that sort of appetite. Many are under the impression that Jesus is talking about even the kinds of unsuspecting ambushes we get sometimes, fellas. Y'all ever been just to the grocery store just after milk, egg, bread, and cheese, and a plunging neckline walks across your path? And wait a minute, you find yourself kind of sort of awkwardly looking away, trying to just, all you went in there for was milk, bread, eggs, and cheese. You didn't want to buy all that, did you? Well, some ladies need to be careful how they dress, because Scripture also teaches that being provocative in dress is wrong as well. So be careful with that. Men, that doesn't let us off the hook, though. We're to be self-controlled even when Satan's baiting us with that kind of temptation. Even when the provocative dress walks by, we are still to be self-disciplined. According to this passage, the onus is still on us to do the right thing in our hearts and in our minds, and not let our gaze linger. And so Christ is not talking about those unsuspected moments. He's talking about those moments when we go into the grocery store scanning the landscape looking for it. That's the type of intentionality that Christ is addressing here. When you look upon a woman to lust after her, it's a premeditated thought. It's with intention to do exactly that. And so if one of those ambushes does happen, you still have to be responsible in that moment and not let it turn into a long glare, staring gaze. Be careful not to let the unsuspected moment turn into an intentional moment. So it is, the lustful look, first of all, is a premeditated look. Have you been disciplined in your minds to view ladies as helpmeets and not as objects? Secondly, the lustful look is a prolonged look. A prolonged look. You look at the lust, it's a prolonged look. Prolonged look is what David did with Bathsheba in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Let's flip back over to the Old Testament to 2 Samuel for a few moments. 2 Samuel chapter 11. In verses 1 through 5. And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all of Israel. And they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. He should have been minding his own business out there on the battlefield with his men, but he wasn't there. He tarried at Jerusalem, laying around the castle. Verse 2, and it came to pass in an eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. Well, if David had just glanced instead of lingered with that look, he would have been much better off. Because verse 3 starts the process that got him into so much trouble. And David sent and inquired after the woman. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, a wife of Uriah the Hittite? And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him. And he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness. And she returned into her house. And the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I am with child. Man, that went south quick. It started with a look. A lone one. She was, it says at the end of verse 2, very beautiful to look upon. It's interesting that while David did not expect to see her there, he was nonetheless taken with her. He stood there, the text says, and she was very beautiful to look upon. He just didn't happen to glance out the window and then avert his gaze kind of in an awkward moment, but he indulged himself, intentionally letting his eyes linger. This led to David sending a messenger to find out about her, and then he sent more messengers to go get her and bring him to him. Found out that she was Uriah's wife. This led to getting her pregnant. This led to him committing murder, which led to a cover-up, which led to a prophet coming to David saying, hey, I know you're a murderer. Which led to David having to confess his sins, which also led to David losing his firstborn child with Bathsheba. The baby died. Y'all ever have to watch a baby die? That's hard to watch. That's judgment in and of itself. And then David was also told by the prophet Nathan that not only would he lose the firstborn child with Bathsheba, but the sword would never depart from his house. It didn't. He ended up having to do battle with his own son Absalom, who almost got David killed off. You see, Uriah had been one of David's top strategists, battle strategists, and without his battle tactician there by his side, Absalom won over many of David's men to his side, and Uriah wasn't there to continue to help David fight as many battle tacticians are able to do. Man, if you got a good battle tactician who knows how to move men around on the battlefield, that's half of winning it right there. But David struggled to win a war. As a matter of fact, he lost the palace for a time. Absalom ran him out of it. And then David had to hide, as he had from Saul, running from cave to cave again, until finally Joab killed Absalom. So all of that hurt, all of that pain, all of that judgment of God on his life because of what? A look that lasted too long. That's sad. That lustful look is a prolonged look. Contrast that with the story in Genesis 39 when Potiphar's wife continually tempted Joseph to lie with her. When she finally grabbed him to force the moment to take place, Joseph ran so hard he ran clean out of his cloak. She was left there standing, holding his cloak. He didn't look back. He didn't lock eyes with her. He didn't have a romantic moment. Just gone. You see, you didn't have to do what you did, David. You didn't have to fix your gaze upon her, David. Joseph didn't fix his gaze upon Potiphar's wife. He left. He got out of there. He got away from the danger. He fled the lust. And so the prolonged look does not have to happen. Many men justified, I'm just bent that way. Oh, most men are. We still have to be self-disciplined. Which brings us to the third point. The lustful look is a perverted look. Jesus teaches us in these verses that this intentional look of lust is a perverted look. Within the bonds of marriage, this kind of longing for another is fine, but when these looks of lust are toward those outside the marriage, what does Jesus call it? He calls it adultery. It's perverted. It's not according to his plan. It's a twisted path that you're on. It's not about the physical act so much as it's about the attitude that gives rise to the physical act. Thou shalt not commit adultery. That's the law in Exodus 20, verse 14. The Pharisees had reduced the interpretation of the law down to just the outward physical act of adultery. You could be stoned if you were caught in the outward act. But the outward obedience up to the law was supposed to represent the inward purity. And the Pharisees forgot about that. And so they had divorced their inward purity from their outward performance. And it's so easy to do that here, especially for men with this particular sin. You notice my little man up there with shades on, don't you? Yeah, you know what men do from behind the sunglasses? Those eyes, they follow the form-fitting dresses. That's a good cover. That's a good cover. That's why I included that little image. But just because the world can't see your eyes, God still knows what's going on behind the shades. Your inward purity is very important to God. The Pharisees had not been hammering that point, probably because they were the ones who liked to put on the show to begin with. They liked looking holy. Yet what Jesus is inferring here is that the Pharisees liked wallowing in lust. I think it's quite telling if you go back up to verse 20, right before he starts this section, where he goes through these 6 things. You have heard it said. Well, who had been saying it? It's the Pharisees. But now I'm telling you, look there again, verse 20, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. The Pharisees hadn't been telling them about internal purity, been telling them about outward performance. They like looking good. Wallowing in lust, well, who's going to find out about that? Instead of viewing females as being created by God as helpmeets, they viewed them as mere objects that could fulfill desires. The implication is that women were uncomfortable just being underneath the gaze of the scribes and the Pharisees. Ladies, y'all know what that's like, don't you? My daughter, every once in a while, she mentions being around a guy, and she gets the vibe. Y'all know what the vibe is? Men, just because you wear the shades don't mean the women don't know that you're giving off the vibe. Sometimes they can pick up on what you're doing in your mind and in your heart. You gotta be careful with that stuff. It's dangerous. It's nasty, it's ugly, it's perverted. And so my daughters had to deal with trying to ease away from a guy she gets the vibe from that's been coming to where they go to church lately. Be careful with that. Be careful with that. It makes people uncomfortable when they figure out that something's going on in their head that should not be going on. And so the implication here is that the women were uncomfortable living underneath the gaze of some of the scribes and Pharisees. How would you, hopefully you don't get the vibe from me, but when your religious leaders, the ones that are supposed to be pure in heart, are giving you the vibe, that's harsh. That's harsh. That's a bad way to live. Any woman who has gotten the vibe from a man will tell you that such a look is a very perverted look. But not only that, fourthly, the lustful look is a preventable look. The lustful look is a preventable look. In our heads, as guys, we tend to justify lust. Perhaps you told yourself, it's not like I'm actually sleeping with the person. Hey, I've heard that line many a time growing up from teens and adults alike. Or what about the old line I've heard from folks in my life? Well, it's okay to look just as long as you don't what? Touchy. But that's not the heart of Christ when he says, if your right eye offends thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. Sexual temptation is a nightmare for many people, but Jesus tells us how to overcome it. He's speaking in hyperbole here, but the point is that we need to take drastic measures if needed, in order to deal with lust. Several things I want to make note of here on that point. Drastic measures are often needed to deal with lust because lust is the kind of thing that demands drastic measures. It's hard to overcome, especially for fellas. It is a hard one to overcome, especially for fellas. And when you see something severe like this, and Christ is saying, chop your hand off, pluck your eye out. What other sin does he say that for, except for lust? He's talking, that seems awful drastic. Yes, he's talking figuratively, he's using hyperbole, but it would have shocked the ears, it would have really got their attention when he's talking about this topic, because it is such a heavy kind of thing to do in order not to sin. What extreme measures do you take to put blinders on your eyes? Job says, I made a covenant with my eyes, not to look upon the young maid. What kind of measures do you have in place to protect your heart and your mind from lust? And so the way Christ is using hyperbole here in this text is quite telling. He is couching the topic as a war that needs to be fought against a very powerful enemy. And we don't really get that from a service reading in our language, but he's using military terms, he's using military thought in order to communicate the need to overcome lust. You see, the blinding of the right eye and the cutting off of the right hand, have you ever noticed he specifies which eye and which hand? He doesn't say just pluck one of your eyes out or pluck both your eyes out. He gets specific. Right eye, right hand. What's going on with that? What difference does it make? Well, he's leaving it. The audience of Christ's time would have known very well what he was referring to. And it would have left an impression on their heart. They knew that he was referring to the type of military things that can happen if a soldier is caught in battle by the enemy. When soldiers fought, they were trained to carry these heavy shields in their left hand, right? And so they would run out there, depending on what culture was from, whether your shields were square, which was mostly Roman soldiers, or other invading armies who carried around shields. Irregardless, the militaries almost universally were trained to carry that big old heavy shield in their left hand. Whether you're running across the battlefield with it, or whether you run, stab it in the ground, and kneel down behind it, you were to peep around. If you got this big old shield in your hand, you peep around it with your right eye, right? So you can see the thrust with your right hand. Normally you're carrying some sort of javelin, some sort of sword, dagger, something in your right hand in order to fight the oncoming enemy. So you've got a shield covering up as best as you can the torso area, the head, and your blade in your body, to where little damage can be done when oncoming strikes ensue with other swords. And so you're blocking swords with this shield, and you're peeking around to see where your enemy's at and know how to thrust. If you pluck out your right eye, guess what you got to do to see around that shield now? You're sticking your whole head out in battle with swords swinging, a bright idea? No. Now you got to stick your head all the way out and look at them with your left eye. And then if you cut off your right hand, that's the one you carry your sword with. Well, that leaves you defenseless against oncoming attacks. And this is a type of a treatment that's mentioned in a couple of places within the Old Testament that armies would do with soldiers that they captured. It was a common thing. If an invading army captured some soldiers, they would a lot of times put out the right eye of their captured soldier and cut off his right hand. And then after that, they may release him. The soldier's been shamed and he's been rendered useless. And it was like an act of ultimate shame for that soldier to have had that done to his body. Because he's ill effective now. What kind of work's he going to get in the military? That's just his life and his lifestyle. He's allowed the enemy to maim him in such a horrific way. And yet Christ comes along and he says, it's better to lose the eye in the hand in the battle against lust than to have your whole body tossed into hell. That's how drastic we need to view this topic of lust. That's how drastic we need to view our tenacity to overcome it, our tenacity to continually be fighting back against it. Because to accept it in and to relax it and to be receptive of it is to not be warring against it anymore. And guess who wasn't warring against it? The Pharisees. And so, finally, as hard as it is to prevent, it's a lot worse just to give up the war. The lustful look is a punishable look. The lustful look is a punishable look. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that the whole body should be cast into hell. People read this and they seem to wonder if Jesus is not preaching a works-based salvation. However, remember that these verses are set against the backdrop of verse 20 again. Lest your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, you're not going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Christ is insinuating that the religious leaders themselves were eaten up with lust, our hearts corrupt with inward adultery, and unless our righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, guess where we ain't going? Heaven. In Matthew chapter 9, we will see how they turn their noses up at Jesus for eating with tax collectors and sinners. Y'all remember that in chapter 9? The Pharisees didn't like Jesus. They said he's eating with tax collectors and sinners. Chapter 9 verse 12 says that they may be, Christ responds to them, says, they that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. Jesus ate with sinners because there are no other kind of people with which to eat. The Pharisees, however, did not see themselves as sinners, and therefore they felt they did not need saving. Their own inward adultery was taking them all to hell. When we get past the point of just, accepting lust on into a heart, rearing back and enjoying the moment behind our shades, we've got to ask ourselves, have we really been redeemed? I still believe God saves us out of some stuff. And when we quit chasing after that pure heart, then we got to start asking ourselves, am I really hungering and thirsting after righteousness? Did Christ change me, and am I saved? And so we need to start asking ourselves these hard questions. Or have I just been all my life putting on the show of outward performance without any purity? Maybe you come down and you made a profession when you were little, but it really didn't stick as far as your behavior is concerned. Have you been just getting by with stuff since because nobody's caught you yet? There are some things that Christ wants us as Christians, as disciples, to put aside. If we're to live in His kingdom as kingdom citizens, these are principles we must live by. And these are changes that Christ will make. You say, well, I still struggle with it. I know I'm saved. I'm certain of my salvation, but I've been struggling with lust forever. I just feel like it's not worth trying. It's too hard for me to overcome. Can you really overcome it with self-discipline? Yes, scriptures say we can. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 25. Do not desire her beauty in your heart. Do not let her capture you with her eyelashes. That word capture there, and then she leads him off into a snare. King Solomon knew what it was to desire beauty and to lust. He learned the hard way. Do not desire her beauty in your heart. Do not let her capture you with her eyelashes. Where does King Solomon put the onus of responsibility for avoiding lust? Puts it on us. Puts it on our own hearts, our own minds. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 1 through 6 commands believers to control their vessels in holiness and honor. Quote, not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. It is possible to possess our own vessels in honor. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which war against your soul. There it is again, war. That whole imagery coming back off. Where do you think Peter learned that teaching from? He learned it directly from his Lord there during the Sermon on the Mount. Job chapter 31, verse 1, I have made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? Think upon there in Job 31, verse 1, could be translated lust after. Why then should I lust after a maid? J.C. Ryle, famous preacher from the 1800s, I believe he was born sometime in the early 1800s. He died in 1900, the turn of the century. He was a preacher who lived in England. He said that a Christian is not a person who experiences no bad desires. A Christian is a person who is at war with those desires by the power of the Spirit. He's on to something there. If you're saved, you've got the Holy Spirit living on the inside of you to help you war, to help you be self-disciplined, to help you overcome, to help you be temperate and self-controlled, and to possess your vessel in honor, as 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 5 teaches us to do. And so, how do we avoid that punishment that comes along with that lustful look? Well, let's not be like the Pharisees, all about outward performance and no inward purity. Do a heart check. Are you truly saved this morning? Or is it all about just being put on a show? Well, a lot of Christians, I think, out there are so-called Christians who've been doing that for a long time. Putting on a show. And it hurts our outward testimony in the community when folks do that. When they claim to be Christian outwardly, and you know, well, doggone well and good, you get the vibe every time you walk by on ladies. No, you can't be doing that. Can't be acting that way. Was it worth the trouble you're in? That is the question that Christ asks each of us. Even if our wives don't catch us, Jesus knows when we're looking to lust. He knows when we're intentionally scanning that landscape to do exactly that. He knows what's going on behind our cool sunshades. Christ views lust as adultery, and it must be overcome with ferocity. Lust must be mortified with uncompromising self-discipline. Pluck out the eye and chop off the hand. No matter the shame it'll bring you in this life, it's better to go and enter into heaven than the whole body cast into hell. And therefore, we are right back to our application question. Do I discipline myself not to lust? Well, the altar is open this morning. If you want to come down and rededicate your life to that kind of warfare, then please come down, kneel down, and commit your hearts and your minds to fight not just the outward attitude of adultery, but the inward attitude of lust this morning. If you wish to make an altar right where you're at, you can do so. If some of what I said this morning has made you wonder about your salvation and you want some assurance of that one way or another, then please come down and speak with me, or come down here and take it up with Christ at the altar. The invitation is yours this morning. What are we singing?